our event today is a call to action from the Global South, scaling the impact of innovation. Before I say a few words by way of background, let me just mention a few logistical matters. First of all, and very importantly for those of you who join from Spanish and French-speaking backgrounds, we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation to and from English, French, and Spanish available for those of you who are using Microsoft Teams desktop app. It's important that you use the app if you want to have access to the translations. What you need to do is to click the kudo button near the top of your screen and select the language of your choice. I thank IDSE for making this possible. IDSE will also put in the chat function, will put instructions in Spanish and French for how to access the simultaneous interpretation. Now, I should say, although I don't see the signal on yet, we are recording this session and we'll post it on our website. So if the recording button is pushed on, go ahead. Please, for all of you who are not speaking at any given time, make sure to have your microphone muted and also shut down your video when not speaking, because this will improve the transmission quality for all. So let me mention then a few words by way of background. First of all, Larry and I founded the Scaling Community Practice about 7 years ago because we believed, and we still believe, that without a focus on scaling successful innovations and interventions, there really is little or maybe no hope to achieve the ambitious development and climate targets, the SDGs and the Paris Agreement targets. The community practice is now an active network aiming to support learning and promotion of the scaling agenda in development and climate action. We have some 2,000 members now from over 400 organizations. The community works in 9 working groups. It has a website. The website is www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. So www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. We issue quarterly newsletters and we organize community-wide workshops and webinars. Over the last 2 years, the community practice has begun to tackle some important cross-cutting issues in scaling, and you will find the relevant publications, working and position papers on our websites. One working paper, for example, is taking stock of what are some of the most important cross-cutting issues in scaling that we should tackle. Then there's an issues paper on how scaling relates to systems change. There's a position paper of the community practice on scaling principles and lessons for practitioners, and a working paper on institutionalizing new development initiatives in governments will be posted shortly. And most relevant for the current webinar,
Hello, Teleke, how are
we have
you?
recently started work on the question how to mainstream scaling into the operational practice of development and of climate donor organizations. And this, of course, is precisely the focus of today's webinar. So we're very pleased to cooperate with IDSE into organizing today's event, especially since it brings to the community practice the experience of experts and practitioners from the Global South with their call to action addressed to the international donor community. Haley and Rob will moderate the event today. They'll introduce the agenda, explain how the call to action came about, and then introduce the panelists. For the Q&A session, Haley will explain the procedure for raising questions and comments. And at the end of the webinar, which we expect to take about 90 minutes, Larry will briefly summarize some key takeaways. Lastly, by way of introduction, let me introduce Haley and Rob. Both are from IDSE's Policy and Evaluation Division, and both are involved in IDSE's Scaling Science Initiative. Haley Price Kelly is a Senior Evaluation Officer at IDRC. She will introduce the scaling exchange process that led to the call to action and that we're discussing today, as well as the co-authors who will be speaking about it. Robert Mclean is a senior evaluation specialist at IDRC and co-author of the book entitled Scaling Impact, which I recommend to all of you that are interested in scaling. Rob will be moderating the question and answer segment, as well as a discussion of a couple of funders and development agency representatives that are responding to the call. So with this introduction, let me hand off to Haley. Haley, the word is yours.
Thanks very much, Johannes. Just let me share my screen here. Great. So thanks so much for joining us, and thanks so much to the Community of Practice for hosting this webinar. As Johannes said, I work with IDRC, and I'll be introducing, first of all, the Scaling Exchange, which is the process that led to the call to action we'll be discussing today. And IDRC supported the Scaling Exchange as a part of the Scaling Science Initiative and as one means of improving how we and other funders and development agencies can put a principles-based approach to scaling into practice and improve our support. So I'll take about 10 minutes. I'll pass off to two of the authors of the call after that, and then we will have time for question and answers, as well as to hear some responses to this call to action from a couple of funder and development agency representatives. So first, just to give you some context for the Scaling Exchange, I'll briefly introduce the Scaling Science Initiative. So we understand scaling science to have two meanings. First, the science of scaling, or the study and empirical understanding of scaling and how it can benefit society. And second, scaling of the results of research and innovation, or the process of an approach to scaling for optimal impact. As an initial contribution to the science of scaling and these understandings of how we can best go about it, and with the impetus of a strategic objective on scaling in IDRC's last strategic period, IDRC commenced a study of what scaling looks like in research and innovation for development, which is, of course, what IDRC funds. And this was really an opportunity to look systematically at the experience of innovators in the global south with scaling, and to learn from this experience about how we should approach it. So while we found there was no blueprint for scaling, what did emerge is a common set of principles that the researchers and innovators that we support were using to guide their efforts to scale impact. And really the focus here is on scaling impact rather than just on scaling actions or interventions. So I'm going to speak very briefly to these four principles just because they underpin IDRC's understanding of scaling and also the reflection that took place through the Scaling Exchange process. First, the Justification Principle asks us to consider not only whether we can scale, but whether we should scale. And it says that scaling is a choice. It needs to be justified based on technical evidence of scaling potential, but also the values of those involved and impacted, which means the choice to scale should be shared. The principle of optimal scale challenges the idea that bigger is better. The fact that a solution works in one context or for a particular group of users doesn't necessarily mean that it should be scaled. And pursuing optimal scale then means balancing considerations of the magnitude of impact with the variety of impacts, equity, and sustainability of impacts. The Coordination Principle acknowledges that scaling occurs in complex systems, requiring both planning and adaptation to engage many actors who need to be involved in achieving impact at scale. And finally, the principle of dynamic evaluation pushes us to go beyond asking whether impact was achieved by a certain date, and it asks how, why, under what conditions impact was achieved and how this might change. So it reminds us that scaling itself is an intervention that can and should be evaluated on an ongoing basis. So as I mentioned, these really were underpinning IDRC's thinking about scaling and how we were trying to approach the issue. That said, even with these evidence-informed principles in hand, questions remained. The study that I mentioned was retrospective, so when it comes to putting the principles into practice, we still needed to understand the challenges and the opportunities that the researchers and innovators we support would face in using them. Relatedly, we needed to understand how we and other funders and development agencies could support researchers and innovators in the Global South to put these principles into practice. And the scaling exchange really is what allowed us to address these questions by learning from the experience and the expertise of our own grantees. So the process had three objectives. First was to just convene and consult a group of grantee researchers and innovators with scaling experience from across regions and across disciplines. And we designated this group of 18 researchers, pictured here on the slide, scaling advisors, to recognize the contributions they could make to strengthening our approach and practice. Second, we wanted to discuss with them, as I mentioned, the opportunities and challenges related to applying a principles-based approach to scaling impact, and crucially, how IDRC could improve its support for scaling efforts. Finally, we were aiming to amplify Global South contributions to thinking on scaling, considering that global communities and conversations can often be dominated by Northern experiences and voices on these issues. So in terms of the process, we worked with think tanks who provided external facilitation. And in 2020, this really began as a consultation with our grantees structured around the 4 principles I spoke to earlier. And at this point, we were really focusing on sharing lessons internally within IDRC to inform our programming approaches. We realized, though, with the scaling advisors and with think tanks, that a lot of these lessons would be relevant beyond IDRC. And we saw this as an opportunity to translate learning into a set of concrete actions that funders and development agencies could take to take these principles on board and support scaling for impact. And again, this was also an opportunity to amplify these invaluable contributions from the Global South in global conversations about scaling. So advisors drafted the call to action over the course of 2021, again with facilitation and editorial support from think tanks. And today we're pleased to be here with some of the authors who can speak to the launch of this call to action, which is now live at scalingexchange.org in English, French, and Spanish. So in a moment, we'll have a chance to hear more about the call and its content from some of the authors. But before I pass it over to them, I will just say one of the reasons we're so glad to be with this audience today is because we really hope this work will get all of us, funders, development agencies, and beyond, thinking about how we can act on this call to action from the Global South. And if you do visit the site and you scroll to the bottom of the call to action, you'll find ideas on how to start conversations about this in your organizations, as well as downloadable PDFs and PowerPoint versions of the call that we hope will support you in doing so. Now, before I introduce our next speakers, 2 of the authors of the call, just to give you a sense of what's coming next. So we'll hear more from the authors, as I mentioned, to give you more about what's in the call. And after their presentation, we'll have time to open the floor to Q&A with the audience that my colleague Robert Mclean will facilitate. So just recognizing that using the chat panel might interrupt the simultaneous interpretation for those listening in Spanish or French, we've set up this Slido, which you can go to slido.com in a browser and enter this code 5535329. And that way, if you have questions that come up as you're listening to the speakers, you can start to post those there. And we will also open the floor after the presentation. And if you'd like to ask a question in French or Spanish, we can always translate those. And Rob will remind you of this as well after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to 2 of the lead authors of the call to action to tell you more about it. And you can see the full list of authors on this slide here. So I would ask Petronella Chaminuka and Tatiana Rincon, our next speakers, if you could turn your cameras on, that would be great. And just by way of introductions, Petronella Chaminuka is the principal economist at the Agricultural Research Council in South Africa. She holds a PhD in environmental economics from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, apologies for my pronunciation, and a Master of Science in agricultural economics from the University of Zimbabwe. So she has more than 20 years international experience working as a lecturer, researcher, and facilitator in rural development. And Tatiana Rincon is Vice President of Gender, Social Protection, and Livelihoods at Fundación Capital in Colombia. She has over 15 years of experience in social protection and poverty reduction policies. So she has an MA in International Relations from Carleton University and a degree in Finance and International Relations from Universidad Externado in Colombia. So with that, I will pass it over to the two of you and really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley, and good day, and thank you to everyone that has joined us on this webinar. So I'm going to just introduce the key principles that we drafted in terms of this core. But before I do that, I just want to also state that I think the experience itself in terms of the participation in the scale exchange was a life-changing experience for me as a development practitioner, because I had been thinking about these things, but not in quite a structured way that we got to exchange the experiences, very diverse group of people that participated as scaling advisors in that scaling exchange. And it was an extremely enriching experience. And I'm sure my colleagues will agree that now we look at the whole idea of scaling differently. I had never thought that, you actually need to do it in a systematic and be scientific about it. So yeah, it's been a really good experience. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the virtual gathering that we had in 2020 going into 2021, they allowed us to exchange ideas and experiences in terms of how we as development practitioners can actually better support scaling efforts in our organizations, but also as researchers, just to step back and think, okay, what is it that we actually mean by the concept of scaling, and what do we scale? I had never thought of impact in terms of, okay, we need to, scale the positive impact. It was more like, yeah, we need to just scale without necessarily actually considering that the impact itself has different dimensions. So there you will see the diversity in terms of the gender, the age. Some of it doesn't show on the picture, but the background as well as the experience in terms of the scaling advisors. Next slide, thanks. So we structured, we had a lot of back and forth in terms of developing the call, and eventually we settled on 8 actions that we thought they would be able to guide donors in terms of going forward when we try and really consider how do we ensure that all the investment that goes into R&D actually translates to impact at scale. So these 8 actions, we've summarized them there. I will just quickly go through them, but the next set of slides after the slide then helps us to unpack each one of these 8 actions. So the first action that we came up with was that there is a need to keep the focus on scaling impact, because like I said, there's many actions that are happening. Every researcher, every development agency is trying in one way or the other to do some kind of scaling action, but nobody really thinks in terms of, okay, what are we scaling? We're scaling, for impact. So we tend to think about scaling in terms of numbers. So the emphasis is, okay, we want to reach as many people as possible, but we're not really stopping to think that maybe a larger scale isn't necessarily sustainable. And in terms of the differential impact of our scaling actions on different groups of people. So we need to think, okay, this intervention that we are scaling what is the impact on different sets of people, and consider that in terms of the decisions that we make. And also be mindful of the fact that sometimes we do get negative impacts, and we need to consider, how we deal with those negative impacts. And some of those, of course, pertain to the impact on social and planetary health. So we are saying that it's time to rethink what is the purpose of scaling. And our key argument is that we should focus on scaling the positive impact that an innovation has on different dimensions in terms of lives, livelihoods, as well as the environment, of course. And for us to be able to effectively do that, then we need to analyze what are the trade-offs of different scaling actions that we put in place. And we think about scaling beyond just the magnitude of it. So we start to think as a collective of scaling in terms of magnitude, the variety, the equity is an important one, and also the sustainability of the impact. So this kind of almost calls for a mindset change in terms of how you approach scaling as an individual, as an organization. And we also have to consider, okay, for each intervention or each action, what is the optimal scale that we are seeking to reach? Next slide. Another important action to consider as well, and this is particularly important in terms of making a decision on what kind of projects or programs are we funding. Because what usually happens for scientists and researchers is they have a tendency to really, kind of look at it from a disciplinary perspective. But what we've also now realized, and particularly around issues of climate change, as well as our experience with the COVID pandemic, is that problems do not know disciplines. So we need to think in terms of participatory approaches, in terms of, trans, multi and interdisciplinary approaches. So when we approach scaling, then we should be mindful of approaches that actually overlook the participation of local agency, because in doing that, we actually leave behind the people that we are trying to put this intervention in place for, but we also miss out on ensuring that the positive impact of our efforts reaches those people that we are targeting. So we've learned that broad and evolving participation in the scaling process is critical to navigate the different ways in which scaling will involve and affect different stakeholders. And we need to be able to balance those potentially competing interests. And for us to be able to do that, then participatory and inclusive approaches are very important. So we consider working not only with those that support the intervention that we want to put in, but we also need to identify who does not support us, how do we bring them on board, where do we find common ground, so that we can be able to mitigate any potential challenges that might arise in terms of our actions. So we call on funders and developing agencies to place emphasis on participatory and transparent approaches to scaling, so that we can ensure that the pursuit of optimal scale considers the perspectives of diverse and evolving groups of stakeholders. And also in terms of the structuring of the funding, to be mindful that participation takes time and it takes resources. And we cannot afford to leave anybody behind if we want to have sustainable impact. Next slide. And then also another important concept that we don't normally think of is the equity of impact. So we need to, create awareness around this concept of equity of impact, not just the magnitude, because in terms of the work that we do, we are in a fight not only against poverty and environmental degradation, but also equality and social justice. And this is underpinned in the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we've also found over time is that the root cause of poverty and instability is often these inequities that exist across different social groups. So for our research and innovation to be meaningfully beneficial to all, we need to place equal emphasis and scrutiny on who we are helping and who is being left behind. And to do this, we have to be constantly assessing the implications of our actions on equity of impact. So that dynamic evaluation is very important. And we also need to be creative and to really dig into the toolbox of methodologies in terms of, how we are able to assess that impact. So we also call on funders and development agencies to value and encourage results that contribute to equity of impact, and to consider these as equally important as those that build magnitude of impact. So please do not only focus on numbers as a measure of project success. We need to have all these other measures that are actually jointly defined with the target group that we want to reach. So that requires decisions about scaling to be informed by ongoing consideration of and engagement with the people that stand to lose or to benefit from scaling. Next slide, thanks. The fourth action point speaks to a very important issue, the impact of our actions on the environment. So the environment needs to be considered as an integral part of the scaling system, because in reality, scaling affects and is affected by more than just people. We coexist in an environment, a particular type of environment, and our efforts in terms of maintaining that environment have long-term consequences, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. So the effect of any scaling process must be considered amongst the variety of impacts that we weigh up in terms of pursuing optimal scale and in terms of the decisions that we make. So we need to consider environmental factors and changes in the environment, including climate over time, as these can enable or constrain any scaling efforts. And given that the climate crisis poses disproportionate risks for populations that are socially and economically or otherwise marginalized, we need then to consider the environmental impact and how our actions are likely to interact with the environment in our pursuit of scaling impact. What you also find is that typically the Global South has been quick to acknowledge the urgency of environmental changes, but at the same time, we've also borne the brunt of those consequences of different actions, particularly in pursuit of economic growth on the environment. So we also call for funders to have explicit and focused attention in terms of the impact on our natural environment, and the decisions that are made regarding what kinds of projects, what kinds of efforts we support for scaling impact. I'll hand over to Tatiana now.
Thank you, Petronella. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I just want to add to what Petronella also just mentioned about the fantastic opportunity that we had last year for meeting with colleagues from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and be able to exchange. Thank you so much to the community of practice. It was a fantastic opportunity. And well, next, I'm going to share with you the other principles that we agreed on and that we found out that are very important in terms of our work. So another important aspect is about moving from the project logic to a systems approach, a systems change approach. And usually what happens is that project funding cycles tend to last from 1 year to 2 years to 3 years. And if we are thinking about the long term and we are thinking about scaling, sometimes the project logic doesn't fit with a long-term perspective. Also, if we continue just working on the consequences of poverty or the challenges that we have ahead, very little will change. So we need to think about the root causes of the challenges that we have ahead, that we have in mind, and see how in parallel of working with a specific population, a specific group, we are also tackling the root causes of poverty or the challenges that we are working with. And also related to that, a single project or a single organization cannot transform the society or can reach very little. So if we want to really go to scale and reach impact, we have to change our mindset and think about how we can work in collaboration with others in order to achieve effective results and be able to broaden the spectrum of our work. Next one. And also just simply scaling, especially scaling up what works. It is not necessarily like the best pathway to work. We need to think about a learning culture instead. And what do we mean by that? What was in our minds when we were discussing this principle? And is that all of us, we are very surprised about the changes that we are witnessing during the last 3 years. Like the world has been speeding out faster, and we need to have an open mind, and we need to adapt. Because even if we have the very best laid plans, sometimes the circumstances and the context change so much that we need to be flexible. And we are very familiar with impact evaluations, with randomized controlled trials, and and those evaluation tools have been fantastic to really identify what works and what doesn't work. But sometimes these type of tools are insufficient, or these types of evaluations are insufficient to understand the complexity that we are living right now. So we need to embrace a learning culture where we can embrace different types of evaluation, where we can really team up with donors and with funders, and really keep in mind that the end goal is to scale the positive impact of a solution. And since the context is changing so rapidly, we also need to move fast and be dynamic, be humble, and be able to really assess what we have in front of us. Next one. Also, another action item that we discussed with the group is about the need to support Southern solutions. And very often in the South, there is not only innovations, but there is also research. There is also a lot of experience, a lot of growing experience. But sometimes we feel that the evidence that gets prioritized is evidence produced only by the North. So when we can have like mixed teams, when we can really have like a more global approach and avoid overlooking locally generated evidence, I believe that we are reaching more impact, and this resonates a lot with one of the key principles that Petronella was mentioned at the very beginning, and is like in at least in my experience and in the experience of many of my colleagues, like the biggest innovations that we have found is when we are able to go to the field, talk to the people, listen, embrace what others, I mean, the way people have overcome the challenges that they have in front of them. So when we are trying to, if we are trying to support the South, we need to see how we can support Southern solutions, and also look at the evidence that is being produced by the South. And next one. And last but not least, because we are leaving space for Q&A and for a dialogue, is we need to invest in the science of scaling. And why do we mean by that? We must work together to find and scale solutions. This is a global problem. This is not a problem of the South, but we are living, I mean, we are aware that we are really living in a global world, and we need to learn from each other, and we need to see how we can, in a systematic way, learn and advance all this community of practice by building these communities, by strengthening these communities, by testing models and commissioning research in different countries, not only that are sometimes like evidence and research that is only country specific. It's limited, so if we can really have like a global approach, that will help us advance the innovation and all the work that we have ahead. And also we need to see how we can continue supporting research, debate, and continuous learning and improvement in order to really scale up and scale the positive impacts of the research and the knowledge that we have gained throughout these years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, and thank you so much, Petty. My name is Rob Mclean. I'm with the International Development Research Center, and I'm going to jump in to moderate us through a discussion at this phase. And Petty and Tatiana, I prepared my proper words of thanks for you, but as you know, each time you do this, I get excited and I throw out the playbook. So I really mean this is incredibly motivating. I appreciate your kind words about this being an opportunity for you, but clearly with the near 150 colleagues here today, the work that you've created for us resonates. This motivates me to do better in my work, and I believe fully this will make a difference for how we approach scaling and development. And I thank you and your co-authorship team. So many of those co-authors are in the room today for all of this work that brought us here. So what I'd like to do is remind colleagues of the Slido, where you can type in a question by following the QR code. I would also ask that if you'd like to speak and ask a question, you can ask that question by raising your hand in the room. If you'd like to make a comment, please record it on the Slido. It will let us take away what you want to share and reflect on it later, which I think will hold great value. So I'm going to actually kick off this conversation, however, with a few questions of my own. And I'm going to go right to Tatiana to follow up on what you've just shared with us. And I'd like to know if you could make it a bit more practical. If you have an example from an organization you've worked with where you've been able to address one or more of these 8 actions. And then, because this is a call to action for funders, could you let us know a little bit about the steps that funders would need to take to strengthen your ability to enact these actions?
Thank you, Rob. Well, one practical example is many years ago, we learned from BRAC in Bangladesh about one fantastic program that they have about lifting people out of extreme poverty. This program is called the graduation programs. And this was an innovation that they were doing at that time. IDRC and the Ford Foundation look at that specific innovation, and they say, okay, maybe this could be interesting to test in different places, even to try it in Latin America. We learned from them. We learned from BRAC, and we took the idea of this program and we made adaptations in Latin America. We even tested this innovation in different countries, and also, like for us and for the founders at that time, they from the very beginning, for them it was evidence that there was a bottleneck, and the bottleneck was the scale, because those were programs that being funded by BRAC is the largest NGO, but those programs were being scaled by small NGOs, and we said, okay, look, we need to integrate a new partner in this scenario, and we said, okay, let's work with the governments. And why with the governments at that time is because the governments in Latin America, they run conditional cash transfer programs, which are like the main and the most established social protection programs. They reach millions of people, and we said, okay, if we can integrate this innovation within their social protection programs, we may be able to scale, but we cannot just replicate what we just saw in Bangladesh. We need to do adaptations, we need to learn. So at that time, our funders, for example, funded a very flexible agenda, learning agenda. And it was fantastic because we created a global alliance of researchers between in the north, in the south. We work with several Latin American universities and also with Canadian universities, with universities from the United States, and we created a global community of evaluators and researchers and people who are doing innovations. And the result is from a very little experiment. Right now, we were able to reach more than 50,000 families. And in the next 2 years, we are planning to reach 80,000 additional families. And the impact of the program has been tremendous. Also, we didn't know at that time, we didn't have, what we did, but it was organic at that time, is that we were really scaling up the positive impact of this specific program. We weren't just scaling up graduation, but even though if Latin America sometimes is not as heterogenic as Africa, we need to make adaptations and changes in each country and make the program very specific. So to me, that was a fantastic opportunity of working in collaboration. Of course, there were a lot of challenges. For example, if we are working with governments, which are a key partner for us, sometimes you have to face elections. You have to face, well, thanks God, we have to face elections, but we have to face challenges and changes with policymakers. Sometimes you have to start over again. Sometimes we were running a program in one country and then something happened and we have to start in another country, for example. So far, we have been very lucky to have very flexible donors who have supported us and accompanied us throughout this challenge. But flexibility is key. We engaged with a new group of donors. They were not as flexible as the previous one, so it was a challenge adapting. But I guess they got the idea, and we have been able to continue moving forward and looking for opportunities. But this is one practical example of how scaling can be done, even if it's challenging for some moments and at certain times.
No, that's fantastic. Really helpful, Tatiana. And I recall from our fish bowls and our debates and our discussions over the year, you were always a champion of accepting impact evaluation, but asking for more. And this was central to the argument you brought to this group over and over again, that impact evaluations will tell us what is, but they might not be the full story we require to scale. And so I hear that in your example now too. And I just want to congratulate Fondation Capital for the work you're doing in that field too. It's fantastic stuff. So Petty, I'm going to come back to you now, and I'm going to ask you a pretty tough question. You've been a lead author on this call to action with your colleagues. And now that it's live, and now that kind of the words are out there and resonating with people, what would you like funders to do now, today, to turn this from a call into a movement? And what are some of the things you could see them practically doing, understanding the constraints that I know you're well aware of that funders work in, to help us move forward? And I'm going to ask you, maybe after you reflect on that, to tell me your vision of what it could look like in 10 years if funders do take this call seriously and listen to the experience of our Southern partners and work together to create this call coming to fruition.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, so I think for me, the first obvious thing is I would like funders to read the call and to heed each one of the 8 actions that we have proposed in terms of how they make decisions regarding what kind of projects to fund, but also how, as donors, you also structure your own programs, your own strategies in aid of development. And the next calls for funding that I want to see, I want to have some kind of, evidence that indeed there is consideration of these actions, because it all starts with how the call is structured. What are the key issues that are reflected as, being an integral part of those winning kind of project proposals? And I just want to say that, there is already, I think, some headway that is being made. If you look at the IDRC Clay call, you see some of the principles already that are reflected in that call. So we're slowly getting there, but I would like to see, as a researcher, as a development practitioner, more and more of that kind of almost a change in culture in terms of how donors do business. And I would also like to challenge, funders to come up with new metrics in terms of how successful programs or projects are defined. Because we tend to go with the traditional number of publications and the number of people that are reached and all that, but clearly that is not enough in terms of where we want to be, and to help us to move towards achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Then I also would like to see more and more, I think, funds that are put aside to help to build capacity for scaling science, because it is not something that is taught in university. At least in my part of the world, it's not. So we need to kind of, build a critical mass of people that, they have the level of awareness, but also the expertise for us to be able to move forward. And then in terms of how, before I respond to you, I also just want to kind of put on the table my expectations for fellow scientists, fellow development practitioners in the Global South, that we need to have, a community of practice that is active. We need to have a critical mass, amongst ourselves if we are to, help our organizations in terms of the change in culture, the mindset change, even in terms of how we do business. But my expectation, my belief is that if we fundamentally change how we do things and how we look at, look and approach at scaling impact, we will get to a situation where the beneficiaries of research and innovation themselves become ambassadors So we as scientists will not even need to go to funders to ask for funding or for any kind of assistance. The communities themselves, we are co-creating with them. We are, involving them in terms of the participatory approaches. And we are also, they are the beneficiaries. They are really experiencing the impact that comes, from scaling of research and innovation. So they become the ambassadors themselves in terms of, motivating for new ways of doing things, whether it's, government funding or, local, even local mobilization of funding, because I believe that where there is benefit, the average person will make available the resources that are required for that intervention to be instituted. So yeah, in a nutshell, we will have different ambassadors for science and innovation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Eddie. That is fantastic, and the challenging approach you always bring. And I especially appreciate, as an employee of a Northern Research Funder, the notion that we ask our research community to innovate, to find solutions, and to help bring those to scale. But we too must innovate the way that we fund, oversee, and evaluate those projects to support that process happening. And your call for different metrics, rethinking the way that we measure success to be more inclusive of all of these issues you've touched on is something I'm listening to, and I think is really timely for our practice internationally as funders. So thank you for that. And Tatiana, not to let you off the hook, because I think I just pitched a fastball, I would like to ask you to, what is the one or two things that funders should do now that they've seen the call, from your point of view? Of course, we want them to embrace everything, but what would you prioritize?
Well, I would prioritize two things. One is to go beyond the project cycle. I know that sometimes it depends on the way even funders get the money to fund these initiatives. So it's something that sometimes is not only a control or can be transformed only by them. But if we really want to see impact, we need to think about how we can overcome the project cycle calendar and see how we can transform the way this is being done. And also, to me, I believe it's really important to see how we can fund initiatives that can transform or can address the causes of poverty and inequality and go beyond the specific, the immediate gains of what can be achieved with a particular project, especially if it's a very, very time-bound, traditional project. So, for example, if we want to really transform our world, we need to be more equal in terms of on the way we work with men and women and with other genders. We need to see and promote like gender equality, but it is not only about empowering women, but see how we can transform, for example, social norms. And this is something that takes time and goes beyond a very specific time-bounded initiative. And also, like another cause of poverty and inequality that is going to even going to be more pressing while the time passes is something that Petronella mentioned, and is considered environment as part of scaling. So, even though like our initiatives doesn't have to be directly related with environment, we need to consider this dimension very seriously. So that's what I refer to when I say, okay, we need to seek for more impact. And I'm not saying that we need to and I mean we need to have like the specific impacts of an initiative, but we need to see how we can also address other specific challenges of our time, like gender, like environment, even the digital divide. So is to have a mindset that is only not focusing on the short term, but also in the long term and the medium term.
Excellent. Thank you, Tatiana. And you know, this moving beyond the project logic, as you phrased it, is, you know, going to be extreme disruption, I think, for how funders are operating. But I think, again, very timely. And it's almost as though I think the two of you were in cahoots, this the shared message here, that it's about parameters on timing and parameters on how funding is parceled, but then the measures that come alongside those parameters, as Petronella suggested. Why are we convinced that metrics at end of project cycles are rigorous measures of success in development? I think this is a very short-sighted, funder-centric point of view, and you've challenged us to really embrace that and rethink how we can be active participants in development processes rather than judges and parcelers of funds. So what I'd like to do now is ask anyone who would like to join the floor with a question to raise their hand, and I should be able to see that in the chat. I believe we may have Ursula Harman here, who is one of our co-authors. So I'd invite you to join in, Ursula, if I see you raise your hand. And I'm going to go to the Slido and select a few questions to field for you, Petty and Tatiana. And there's one question on the Slido that's kind of come to the top of the list. And it says, it really relates to, I think, your action on participatory approaches and broadening our understanding. And it says that working with local agencies often poses challenges of capacity, governance structures, and risk tolerance or mitigation. So any recommendations for addressing this for funders? And maybe while you're thinking that one through, because I see that's a tough one for sure. I'll give you another one from the list here, so you can think about a couple at the same time. And another that's been voted up is if you have any examples of a negative impact of scaling that has occurred, and perhaps where the focus was on strictly on magnitude over equity or sustainability or some of the other dimensions we've brought into an optimal understanding of scale. If you could share such an example and how we might avoid that in the future. So would either of you like to jump in on either of those issues?
I don't know if Ursula is still around, so maybe we can prioritize her before she leaves. Or if she's not.
Yes, she is. Ursula, welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, we had trouble connecting Ursula, and I'll just quickly introduce her because she's one of our co-authors of the call to action. And Dr. Ursula Harman is a sociologist with extensive experience facilitating innovation for community development. Currently, Dr. Harman is a researcher at PUCP and UTEC universities in Peru, and a member of the CONCITEC Pro-Women Committee on Science, Technology, and Innovation. Ursula is also concurrently district councilwoman of San Bartolo in Peru, and she's a past Eisenhower Fellow. So Ursula, thank you so much for persevering the technology and getting on board with us. And I hope you've had some chance to listen in, and I just wanted to know if you'd want to jump in with any reflections from your experience.
Thank you, Rob. I'm sorry for the technical problems, but I was here, I was listening to everything, and it was so interesting. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Tatiana, thank you for seeing me in the crowd. And yes, coming to the question you asked, Rob, about the negative example, I probably want to share something with you because it's also related to the question what makes scaling important for me. it's because I was involved in a technology project in Peru that started as a small initiative and then scaled into a government program focused on improving rural houses to face extreme weather conditions in high altitude communities. So it was, in theory, it was excellent. It was like transforming this small a pilot into a public policy. But when the project scaled, there was little attention to the political, social, and institutional aspects that intervene in this process. And in other words, what began as an initiative to empower individuals via technology and knowledge has evolved into just an infrastructure program. And from my expertise, I have always been critical in how this scaling process are taking place, and the question for me always was: are we providing technologies or infrastructure, or are we empowering people to include local knowledge, enhance capacities, and enable citizen participation? In summary, we are tackling the problems that we are supposed to solve, or are we creating more exclusionary outcomes because of scaling?
Thank you, Ursula. That is fantastic, and makes me very happy we got you in here. It's a great response to the question, and I think a fantastic reflection about some organizations think about this as two sides. One, we have to have a supply and a demand of a solution, and empowering both sides of that experience are incredibly important. So Tatiana, your hand is up, and maybe you wanted to jump in on one of those questions from the field.
Yes, I wanted to share about an example of the negative impact of scaling. And at Fundación Capital, we work a lot in microfinance, and we have we have an example with the microcredit industry. 30 years ago, when Yunus discovered the power of microcredit and all the microcredit industry, it was based on the first evidence where microcredit a really good solution for women living in poverty. So like a huge microcredit industry started all around. But it was based only on limited evidence, and the scaling was so fast, and some organizations saw the opportunity to gain funding from this business. So many organizations were created, and the interest rate they were charging users was extremely high. And even they were putting a lot of pressure on women. Sometimes women they were forced to associate with other women because they didn't have a collateral, so they were forced to do women's groups so they can help each other in case they could not repay the credit back. And those women that even some of them they committed suicide, and there was a call from the microfinance industry to really look carefully and cautiously at the microcredit players. So, for example, in our case at Fundación Capital, we don't do microcredit. We say, okay, we are going to explore other sources of microfinance, but not microcredit, because there is a story of a really fast scale. I'm not sure it was. I'm sure it was not what Yunus intended at the very, very beginning. But when you scale things up and you don't continue doing research over the time and continue innovating and being flexible with some approaches, so this is something that we don't want to see when we have a call for scaling. For example, this is something that we don't want to repeat. And also, I have to say about the other question, but maybe Petronella, you want to add more on this, and then I can comment on the second question.
Okay, so I was going to suggest that you actually give that example because it is in our our call to action. So let me rather just respond to what was the first question about issues around capacity, governance failures, I suppose, and risk tolerance for funders. So I think for me, a lot of these problems we can mitigate if we take an approach that right at the beginning enables, facilitation of these multi-stakeholder engagement platforms where the project or, the intervention is not necessarily one that is being brought into the community, but there's a process of co-design and, joint exploration of the options right from the start. So in that process, through these participatory approaches and, taking an approach that ensures inclusivity to the greatest extent possible, you are then able to identify quite early on the differences in terms of multiple perspectives, facilitate a dialogue and negotiation around that. And in that process, I believe, people eventually, or different stakeholder groups eventually find each other. Sometimes it's a trade-off. There is a process of give and take. But you do reach some kind of common ground that then enables, those initiatives to limit the potential damage that could come out of these issues of, kind of different stakeholder intentions. And then the capacity, the issue of capacity, it is indeed, I think, a real problem, particularly in our part of the world. But also these projects, like I said, they need to integrate capacity development, and not only capacity development at the level of, science, but capacity development even at the level of the lowest, beneficiary that we are intending. So you facilitate these, interventions for capacity development. And then with regards to the issue of risk tolerance, one of the things that we discussed during the scale exchange was the fact that when one looks at the landscapes in terms of, how donors have been funding projects, it's almost as if there's a repeat of the mistakes carried from one project to the next, because the next project comes in, they don't learn at all what went wrong in the previous project, and we start again the cycle. So, with this proposed new approach, we actually, have as a starting point an analysis of some sort of what has worked, what hasn't worked, what went wrong in terms of, the scaling initiatives. And we build on that. And when we do that, then we also are able to reduce the risk, but also the very concept of dynamic evaluation enables that continuous evaluation of, okay, this was our target in terms of where we want to go, but now, the goalpost itself has shifted, so we need a change in terms of our strategy to get there. So I think there's certainly enough in the toolbox to be able to minimize these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Petty. Fantastic. But what I'd like to do now is turn to Ursula just quickly. And Ursula, we didn't have the chance to bring you on board earlier, but I really think we have a lot to learn from your background, your experience, and your current position. So I'd like to just hear from you quickly, in a couple minutes, why you've gotten involved in this call to action, what the scaling impacts mean to you, and any lessons at the highest level you'd like to share on this platform now.
Thank you, Rob. The first reason is because I was aware of the problems of scaling, as I told you in my experience. Probably putting in more in context, this is a national program now about this improving these houses is still going on. But what I'm what I always have this critical perspective is the evaluation that we are talking about now a lot, is that they just evaluate how this is a project that improves houses to elevate the temperature with renewable energy, with technologies to improve houses, with a package of technologies. And the evaluation is just focused on how the house is, or the temperature is elevated in the house, and that's it. And you don't evaluate anything else. And from I mean, if you're an engineer, probably, yeah, it's okay. But if you are from other disciplines, is that, and what else? What about the institutions? What about citizen participation? What about decision making? That all these topics we talk in this when I intervene in this project, and it was like just the we didn't have the chance to really implement this kind of perspective into the whole project. It was into the program. We just I participated just in the beginning of the project, and it was like not sure if they really incorporate this perspective. So and it's because also they just work with just one. It's not transdisciplinary. It's just what Petronella said. No, it's about the basis of knowledge, just interpreting innovation, just at putting new technology, and not all the complexity about innovation, about how you incorporate people in the decision making, how you include local capacities, how you include less powerful people into local, regional, and national collaboration networks. So this responding to your question is why I get involved, because the Scaling Exchange for me is an inclusive learning space of discussion. And now we are international collaborative network that we are discussing and learning, and we are really trying to innovate in how we resolve social and environmental problems. And I think this as we created this network, we should create these networks in the same projects that we are managing, so we can promote workshops, exchange programs, communication resources in order to empower these communities of practice that Petronella mentioned about, and also how to innovate in the way we measure and deliver results as we discussed earlier. So yes. That's my appreciation.
No, Ursula, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you involved in this group, and this is part of the reason why I wanted you just to speak to that depth of experience and knowledge you've gleaned from it to share with the group and create this call, and just how diverse the backgrounds are who have created this call that I think has incredible power for affecting the way we go about development. Tatiana, I see your hand is up. I don't know if you want to raise something quick, but I'd love to move on to some responses for you. So go ahead quickly.
Okay, I just wanted to add something to what Petronella just mentioned about working with local partners and the governance challenges, and also the lack of capacity. As all of us know, like USAID is trying to change like the process they give grants, and instead of going through these large intermediate organizations and contractors, they are trying to reach more local communities and organizations. And we have to see how they go. So this is, I guess, all the donors are looking carefully. But I was just thinking that last Thursday, they did the launch of an initiative they were promoting in the Northern Triangle in Central America. And the organizations they selected were absolutely fantastic. I mean, we applied, we were not selected. But I was surprised about the amount of innovation, the energy, and to me, like organizations in the South, they are I mean, the sector is not as it was 20 or 30 years before. Like, there is increasing local capacity. So I believe that funders should also take challenges. Otherwise, we will continue looking at the same results over and over and over. And we need to be bold and think and see how things can be done differently.
Fantastic, Tatiana. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you everyone too who put a question in the Slido. We will keep those on record and return to them. But what I'd like to do now is change pace a little. We've heard the call, and I think it's our responsibility to provide some response to this declaration that's been given to funders. And so I'd like to thank two colleagues I've been working with for years now for their leadership in standing up and reflecting on what this means to them at the organization they work for. So I'm going to ask Anne Germain to turn on her camera first. And Anne is a colleague of mine who has been involved in a number of international development initiatives over the years, notably her work in Bolivia, the Philippines, and DRC. But she is currently the Deputy Director and Head of Development Innovation, the Development Innovation Unit, I should say, a whole team at Global Affairs Canada. And that's part of the Partnerships for Development Innovation branch. Anne is with me, based in Ottawa-Gatineau. So welcome, Anne, and I would ask you please to give us your response. What does this mean to you? What resonates for you?
Thank you, Rob. So thank you first and foremost to our amazing panelists, Petronella, Tatiana, Ursula. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments today that I think contribute to bringing the call to action to life. And I guess reinforce my sense, at least, that there is so much more to be discussed there. I think you're touching on a number of issues that resonate a lot. So thanks to you and your co-authors for this call to action and provoking us into this discussion. As a fellow development professional, as Rob said, working for a bilateral donor for many years now, that's really an opportunity that I welcome. And I thank you for pushing our thinking and helping us to reframe some conventional ideas, getting us to think more and look again at how we allocate time and resources in the fight against poverty and inequality, and how we work to address perceived risks, build capacity, including the need for regular self-reflection exercises. So in the innovation field, we say that when it's uncomfortable, it's a good sign. So I think we have a lot of good signs here. Thank you to the Scaling Cup and to IDRC for enabling the dialogue this morning. I really feel both humbled and privileged to be here, and hopefully this is not the last time. So reflecting on some of the principles of the call to action that you have presented, obviously several of them resonate both with our policies and practice. And because I work with Global Affairs Canada, I have to start with the third principle of making equity of impact an equal measure to magnitude of impact. First, I will say that impact is an essential dimension of innovation. Innovation is about doing things differently for better results. I think Ursula spoke to that very eloquently. It's not just about the technology, it's about the why and the so what. Second, equity, obviously something that's very, very important in the context of a feminist international assistance policy such as ours, and the spirit of which has been integrated into the Whistler principles that were adopted by the G7 ministers that focus on accelerating innovation for development results. Women and girls, including those living with disabilities, including people in all their diversity, need to be recognized and supported, including as innovators themselves. I think that's a point that you made very well, and that this principle reminds us of. The principle of making equity of impact an important measure also speaks to promoting gender equality and to using an intersectional approach, what we call in our organization gender-based assessment plus, GBA plus methodology, which takes into account social norms as well as all the dynamics at play. It's a human rights-based approach, and so this really resonates strongly with us. And certainly there's more to be done to ensure greater equity and inclusion throughout processes and projects and calls, and to measure equity of impact, the impact on gender equality and other dimensions, recognizing that data and assessment sometimes do pose challenges, that sensitivities are at play, that there's a political dimension, and really a requirement for dynamic engagement of people who tend to lose or to benefit, as I think Petronella reminded us very well. It's certainly something we are hoping, again, to pursue conversations on. What does it mean, in particular, in the context of innovation? And this is something we're actually discussing with other funders, for example, in the context of a group we're a member of, the International Development Innovation Alliance, and I think some of my colleagues are on the call this morning as well. Of course, explicit consideration of the environmental impact is another principle that resonates strongly, but this would really merit a specific discussion. And because I have limited time, I'm just going to move to where I thought there are particular challenges, and that's really in the practice of how we fund scaling and how we fund development interventions. And there's two principles that call my attention here. First, moving beyond a project logic to funding impact. And second, supporting a learning culture rather than simply scaling what works, if I may. And I saw that you changed a little bit the phrasing on that one. I think we're really 2 steps removed on that one as a donor agency. I would contend that scaling what works is unfortunately not always as simple as we would hope for, which I understand is one reason for this community of practice. And scaling what works might not work, as you pointed out, Tatiana, in a changing or a different context. And it requires listening and indeed humility, as Tatiana pointed out. And those are not built into organizational processes or bureaucratic processes. It requires mobilizing, ensuring that we look at equity issues and root causes of poverty, again, as you said. This really requires collaboration, continued availability of funding, or handing over to another actor in the sphere who can provide a next round of funding, or in the case of innovations in the health sector, for example, and other social services or government services sector, it requires institutionalization into government institutions who have their own dynamics, as we know. So there's still really a lot to be done, I think, for funders and other actors to work as an ecosystem to scale innovations. That's another conversation that's very live at the moment. And for me, it really reminds me of the continued relevance of the principles for effective development cooperation. And as I was listening to you, I thought maybe we need to add one principle to those, which would take into account the constantly changing context and adaptability, which I think is becoming a constant in a lot of conversations and reality in our experience. So supporting a learning culture or learning approach is what we're trying to promote in the innovation sphere. And it's essential to bringing the impact of innovations to optimal scale. So if I have a couple more minutes, Rob, if you allow me, I would like to just speak briefly to a concrete example on how we're trying to advance this inside our organization. Do I have time? Really taking the policy, the research that was done to policy and practice. So we use the principles of scaling impact and now the call to action, hopefully, and we collaboratively work to build that into a training. And that was at the incentive of our partners. And now we've developed a training for our staff, looking at what does that mean, scaling impact, optimal scale, collaboration, cooperation. We've also initiated a reflection as to how this can be brought into the material we produce, the guidance material. And on the programming side, building on the success of the Canadian International Food Security Research Fund, which was a joint program of our department and IDRC, some of our colleagues are testing a new mechanism that would allow the scaling of impact of demonstrated innovations to scale. And this is really a choice, as you explained. There's a trade-off here. If we choose to purposefully broaden and deepen impact rather than initiate new project lines, then that's where we put our resources. There's other examples I could share. Partnering for Climate is a new call that was issued where we're building a learning community of practice around nature-based solution for adaptation to climate change, engaging with partners, with the community at all stages in the call process. But I just hope that we have continued opportunities to engage and learn with and from you and from our partners as we had the benefit of doing today. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Fantastic. Really, really appreciate your leadership, stepping up and giving us some practical ways that Global Affairs Canada sees an opportunity in this call to action. And I hope this helps create a movement. I'm going to quickly just say we are close to closing time, but we're going to continue. There has been such good discussion. We have 2 more speakers, and we should be done in about 10 minutes, I'd imagine. In total. So I'd like to actually ask another funder representative to join the floor. Leonard Woltering is a scaling expert at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, or CIMMYT. And that's a position he holds that's supported through a GIZ and CGIAR scaling task force. So Leonard is also the chair of this community of practices, Agriculture and Rural Development Working Group. And he's based in Mexico City. And I should say, Leonard and I have a years-long relationship now that goes back to CIMMYT originally hosting the Scaling Exchange in 2020, March of 2020 in Mexico City. And perhaps colleagues online remember what happened in early 2020, and that didn't happen. But Leonard has remained attentive and eager to share for CGIAR, GIZ Task Force, and for CIMMYT specifically, some reflections against the call to action. So over to you, Leonard.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. That was really kind of a nightmare that we went through. We had everything organized. We had you guys coming to the CIMMYT campus. We had GIZ, we had CRS, we had others joining there, people from the community of practice. And then just before that, COVID hit and everything closed down. But I'm really happy to see that you pulled through. I saw you had virtual meetings, and really the result is really amazing. So really kudos to you and the whole team, and really great work. So thank you for that. I want to say a few things about how we at CIMMYT and in the CGR were looking at these call to action. And maybe first some of my own experience, and that is that in 2019, I asked 36 colleagues at CIMMYT what scaling means to them. And I coded their response and learned that 100% of them associated with more of a thing, a technology or a practice. And half of those also mentioned that the outcomes from adopting those things are important, right? And again, half of those, so 25% of the entire group, mentioned that more is not always better, that scaling is not neutral and could have negative consequences as well for the environment and social issues. So I believe that if anyone would ask the same question again today, there would be much more understanding of the complexity and implications of scaling innovations. I believe many more have gone through a process of getting excited, of multiplying the successes achieved at small scale in pilots or projects, and then seeing that a successful pilot is no guarantee for success at scale, because the environment, the system of policies, organization, and behaviors is holding the problem in place. And that's where it gets really interesting. That's where the issue of mainstreaming scaling comes in, because we are also part of that system. We, our organizations, you and me, we have a certain power and influence over others. We set and upkeep ways of working, and we also inflict a certain response just by who we are. And I think it goes even deeper into our own being. Are our ideas of how change happens still up to date? Am I holding up a system that is not producing the results that we want? Am I part of the problem? What can and do I want to change? We soon are going to publish a study where we looked at how the different levels of capacity development are addressed in projects that aim to scale conservation agricultural practices. And yes, most projects were designed around individual trainings, and the reporting focused on this as well. However, when we asked further about capacity development, we found that the project teams were also developing a lot of important capacities at organizational, collaboration, and enabling environment level that they didn't report on, but were critical for scaling. So project teams were doing it because they found it the right thing to do. But these critical activities were hardly asked for. So this study showed us that a lot of good stuff is actually going on that goes unseen and unrecognized because it doesn't fit the log frames or our own expectations of what we should and should not be doing in projects. The call to action and its 8 action points appeal to those that are willing and able to honestly reflect on their approaches, on their own approach to scaling and try something new. Then it makes perfect sense to not settle with numbers of outputs, but focus on whether these outputs have contributed to something good. Then scaling is a locally owned process where they negotiate what is good and enough, and we, the research and development organizations, can only facilitate and support. We then see that the way we design and implement projects are often part of the problem, sometimes causing more harm than good. Rather than promoting or selling our own solutions, supporting Southern solutions does sound much more viable. And yes, the modesty and understanding that our role is not neutral and realizing that there is so much we don't know will make it difficult for anyone not to invest in learning and the science of scaling. And I think it's so powerful that this call comes from the South. It shows us that the current modus operandi is not delivering what we want. It paints a picture of a better way of doing things. And I think we are now in this uncertain limbo between the two. How many people would trade in something they know for something they don't know? It is scary. But today we heard a few examples of what it means to follow some of the proposed actions. And I think in the chat there were also quite a lot of interest for good cases where we show, okay, that it is possible to follow some of these actions. I appreciate really that these 8 actions are accompanied with guidance on how to incite change among your colleagues, organizations, and partners. And I believe, and I want to believe, we are soon coming to a critical mass of people that can tip the scale and put the actions you propose as becoming the new normal. A bit more about the CGIAR. The CGIAR is the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers for the Poor. It is undergoing a major transition towards a one CGIAR. You probably heard about that. And then over the last couple of years, people from all over the CGIAR have come together informally to discuss the challenges in scaling and the limitations our organizations pose to do it right. And I'm really happy that scaling is finally regarded as a thing in itself, not an automatic result of good innovation and piloting. Although the thing is still quite fluid, but I can say that in the one CGIAR, that the big initiatives, the big programs, all have dedicated funds for scaling now. And there is also central guidance on tools and methods that cater for figuring out with partners what scaling means and required in a specific context, using the scaling scan tool, for example, but also much more sophisticated tools such as the scaling readiness to do an entire portfolio analysis on the readiness of innovations for scaling. This will feed into a kind of stage gating process to reflect better on the viability of some of the innovations. At the same time, scaling is well recognized as a cultural issue. Actually, the people proposing the ideas on how the one CGIAR should deal with scaling sit under that unit. We have to remember that the Green Revolution has had a major impact on the culture of the CGIAR, even 50 years later. So I'm really happy that the scaling is so tightly connected to change management on shifting mindsets and behaviors of colleagues to allow better scaling to happen. And this call to action that you presented today should really be an integral part of this culture shift. Now, back to that network of like-minded colleagues all over the world, I think that really remains critical. Scaling is not rocket science, or at least it should not be. It does require people, however, to keep the eye on the ball, that provoke design teams to think beyond project periods and their own comfort zones in terms of capacities and ambitions, to pay attention to incentives and disincentives for other actors in the value chains than just the end users to support the scaling. But most importantly, I think we have to be willing to change ourselves. And now, and hereby I commit to the cause, promote the 8 actions from the call you put forward to us today. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you, Lennart. Really, really helpful to have your momentum behind this important call. And just to say, I can feel that mindset, that courage, that personal ownership is clearly being reflected, and that means a lot. So thank you. Thank you, Anne, again, for the leadership to move from a call to a movement. It's sincerely appreciated, and I'm very excited to where we go from here. Tatiana, Petronella, Ursula, sincere thanks for, again, sharing these lessons on a new platform. I am very much behind continuing this movement with you when you'll have me. So I'd like to invite Larry Cooley, from co-founder of the Community of Practice, to join us to wrap up the session today. And thank you, Larry, for the opportunity to share your platform and have this discussion.
Oh, it was wonderful, and it was a really lovely addition to our Community of Practice and the perspectives that are brought to bear. I'll just say a couple of things. I could just end with amen, in the sense that, I don't think there was a word I heard spoken today that I didn't resonate strongly to, and it's really wonderful to hear it coming from voices in addition to the ones that I'm familiar with. And so let me just say a word about that. Messenger matters as much as message in this arena. And for those of us who've been pushing hard on the scaling issue, I think there's more wrong with our messenger than there is with our message at the moment, in the sense that it's got a certain tinniness when it just sounds like the donor community talking to itself. And I think it has a certain different valence and a different impact when it comes from different voices. So just the very fact that you all are in the game and that you're pushing for what you're pushing, and that you're pushing for it so intelligently and so coherently, I think is an important contribution, and one that we all really welcome. You've probably heard these expressions, nothing about us without us, or where you stand depends on where you sit. I think those are true statements. And the more it's reflected in the work we do, the more we're all going to feel like we're walking the walk and not just talking the talk. So thank you for that. I have a couple of just super brief observations about the substance of what you said. Most of it, if you look at the things that are on the website and the paper about principles and lessons that Johannes referenced at the beginning, you'll find very familiar, very comfortable, and very congruent with what you were saying. And the fact that you came to similar points of view about issues like adaptive management, and about what scaling is and isn't, and about the role of limitation of projects, and about how change happens, it's very gratifying to me, and I'm sure to others, that you quite independently came to very similar points of view. But there were a couple of things I think you sounded quite a different note, and I think those are additions. I think you came through much more clearly than we did on the issue of equity. You'll find that in our publications, but not as prominently as I think you placed it. Similarly, you'll find in what you said, I think more evidently than in what we said, this notion of the potential for secondary benefits or secondary consequences of a not desirable nature, and therefore the desire to view change and impact more holistically. Those, to me, at the content level, are big additions to what we talk about. But more importantly, I think even than that is the fact that we're together in this fight, and that looking at this from really quite different starting points, we found our way to very similar points of action on this. And so that's where I want to end. I want to invite us and invite you to lock arms on this, because we're similarly focused in this moment, not just on changing practice, but within that, trying to reshape the actions of donors. And I think we have the power to do that. There's a lot of rhetoric that's basically going in that direction. Now, so far, not entirely matched by action. So the more we can take the kind of things you're saying and the kinds of things we're saying, bring those things together, or approach the same people from two different perspectives in a coordinated way, the more likely I think we are to seize the moment, and the more I welcome that challenge. Thanks so much for a wonderful session today.